Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
I'm Max, aka Commustar. I'm guest host for this episode. We're joined today by Reuben A. Loffman, lecturer in African history at Queen Mary University of London, and author of Church, State, and Colonialism in Southeastern Congo, 1890 to 1962, published by Palgrave-MacMillan, released in 2019. Reuben, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for hosting me.
So let's start off with a brief biography. What got you interested in the Congo, and what led you to write about the White Fathers and the Spiritans, these missionary orders in Kongolo?
Well, when I was in elementary school, my headmaster was a graduate of the School of Oriental and African Studies, I believe, and he told fantastical stories about Africa, and in particular Kenya, though I didn't understand at the time about the geography. So I knew that I wanted to study Africa from a very young age, but I didn't know exactly where I wanted to study. And so when I was in my high school and I read Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, that focused my fascination with Africa on the Congo specifically. So I'm afraid to say it was Joseph Conrad who focused my African interest.
Oh, no.
Specifically, and I've never looked back, having read Heart of Darkness and wanting to know the facts behind the fiction of that particular novella.
This book focuses specifically on the territory of Kongolo, which is in southeastern Congo. I think a lot of our listeners might not have a very strong idea of where Kongolo is. So can you just go into a brief geography of Kongolo?
Absolutely. So Kongolo, as you said, is in southeastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. So for listeners unfamiliar with Africa in general, if you think of the vast continent of Africa and you kind of look in the middle of it, the vast state of the Democratic Republic of the Congo is sub-Saharan Africa's largest state. So it's a very big blob, if you like, in the center of Africa. And if you focus in on the southeast, you'll find what was the province of Katanga, which is now split into four. And if you look just under the fifth parallel towards the southeast, Kongolo sits just underneath that fifth parallel. So that is, I think, as broad an introduction to Kongolo as I can give, save for the fact that it is bisected by the Congo River as it runs into the southeast. And that name of the river as it comes through is the Lualaba. So you'll often hear me refer to the Lualaba River, which is just another word for the Congo River as it passes through southeastern Congo.
In chapter 2 of your book, you delve into the pre-colonial history. So can you talk a little bit about the societies that lived in Kongolo before the advent of the Congo Free State?
Absolutely. So there are a range of different societies and cultural traditions that inhabited Kongolo before the advent of colonial rule. And I'm going to go into each in as much detail as I think I have time for. And please do stop me if I do run over time. It's important to understand, first and foremost, that these traditions actually changed a lot over time. And I think one of the problems with Belgian colonial forces when they came in was to assume that the traditions were unchanging and to have a primordial conception or a conception of societies as primordial. So the societies that I'm going to talk about changed markedly over time. So first, I think one of the most important groups that I deal with in the book is the Luba of Katanga. And I say the Luba of Katanga because they are different to the Luba of Kasai, who are their ethnic cousins, but based, as their name suggests, in a very different province. So the Luba occupied a great swathe of southern Kongolo. And the Luba peoples generally emerged in the 16th century when many conceptualized their culture as having an empire. And historians now debate the extent to which there was an empire and the extent to which this supposed empire had a central capital. Whatever we think about the idea of the Luba as an empire or as having a central capital, we know that they had a very important Genesis myth. And this myth served first as a way of understanding their origin, but second as a political charter. I want to talk a tiny bit about the myth before moving on to some of the other groups that I need to do. So essentially, Kongolo Mwamba founded the Luba capital according to the Genesis myth near Lake Boya in New Pemba Depression. And the reason I talk about the founder of the Luba as being Kongolo is that makes the name of the territory I study far more intelligible. That it's named after the founder of the Luba group entirely. A hunter from the east called Ilunga Mbidi Kilue arrived in the capital near Lake Boya and married two of Kongolo's sisters, Bulanda and Mabele, and hostility later grew between Ilunga and Kongolo to the point where Ilunga left. Bulanda had a son called Kalala Ilunga who began to overshadow his uncle Kongolo, and conflict between the two grew until Kalala actually killed Kongolo. I should give a trigger warning to this. There will be some violence. We are talking about colonial rule as well as, of course, violence during the pre-colonial era. Now, my point in bringing up Mbidi Kilue is the fact that he was there to teach Kongolo kingly manners, as was his son Kalala Ilunga, incidentally. So Kongolo in the Luba represents a lot of what is bad about being a chief or being a founder, whereas Mbidi Kilue represents everything that's good. So the idea of the Luba Genesis myth is to say, this is what's good, this is what you do to run a polity correctly, and don't do what Kongolo does because he is uncivilized and does things that are beyond the pale, as it were. The Luba Genesis myth functions as both a historical document but also a charter, and the Luba capital, if one does believe in it, was essentially something that essentially produced emissaries who were known as the Fire Kings, because they saw the king of the Luba eat. The Malokwe was the Luba king and the king of the sacred blood, so we're talking about hereditary rule. And Kongolo represents, in the Luba terms, a fire kingdom. So it was an emissary called Kumwimba and Gombe who actually founded this kind of fire kingdom, this outlying kingdom away from the Luba capital, but yet relying on it for some sort of legitimacy in southern Kongolo, or at least based in part in southern Kongolo. So that's the Luba. There's a variety of things to say about the Luba that I can get more into detail about if you'd like. But moving towards the Hemba on the right bank of the Lualaba River, the Hemba, I believe, are a disarticulated subset of the Luba, by which I mean to say it's a very complicated way of saying that the Hemba were a Lubaized group. They adapted some aspect of Luba culture, and so they became very close to the Luba, but they were independent from them. And I believe that the Hemba were in fact migrants from Eastern Congo, perhaps even if you go back as far as perhaps the 15th and 14th centuries, even as far as Tanzania. But effectively the Hemba migrated into Kongolo and they took on aspects of Luba culture. So if you like, there are some aspects of Luba culture which unite Kongolo, but it's worth saying that there are also the Songye as well as the Luba and Hemba who exist in Kongolo, and they also exist with the Luba on the left bank of the Lualaba River. The Songye are far more difficult to trace. There are a variety of different Songye groups that we can know about from the pre-colonial period, but I agree with a number of historians that the name Songye was actually popularized during the Congo Free State era. So in many ways it's a product of European ethnography and anthropology as much as it's an organic product of African culture. And the Bangu Bangu group are also another very difficult group to trace in terms of ethnogenesis. I think they also were immigrants from Eastern Congo who arrived in Kongolo roughly the same point as the Hemba. So those are some of the groups that exist in the Kongolo territory, alongside, incidentally, the Genya, which is a Swahili word for fisher people. So you can see how that name emerged, and the Genya, typically as their name suggests, were often to be found on riverine regions of the Lualaba. And likewise, there are some Twa peoples who, in colonial parlance, are named Pygmies. And so they
Twa people also in Rwanda.
Exactly, yes, precisely, yeah. And like, unfortunately, in Rwanda, there was a good deal of discrimination against them. There were aspects of Twa-Bantu relations that were very positive. And in fact, when I did my field work, they were very positive relations. But there have, unfortunately, been a very, very important conflict in a contemporary sense between the two groups, Bantu and Twa, which is regrettable, to say the least.
About the Songye, in the book, and I think you are referencing Reef in Rainbow and the Kings, the foundation and myth of the Luba mentions the Songye. So is that an indication that there were Songye near the Upemba Depression, or is that sort of a later interpolation?
The honest answer is I'm not sure. I think that the Songye were in the Upemba Depression, so they did emerge in the same place as the Luba, so again the Upemba Depression. But my honest answer to you is I don't know exactly about the ethnogenesis previous to the Free State administration. As I say, it's likely that there were a number of Songye groups and they have a relationship with the Luba, but as you suggest, that could well be a later interpretation. But unfortunately, I can't say for sure today.
Okay. So also you make clear that at the second half of the 19th century, the Zanzibari incursions into Eastern DRC, what would become Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, had a very transformative impact. So can you just go into the Zanzibari incursions for a little bit?
Absolutely. So for your listeners who are unfamiliar with broadly African history, the Zanzibaris were a group of predominantly mixed-race people from Bantu and Omani Arab families who grew up speaking Swahili, and they emerged from the archipelago of Zanzibar. So Nguja Island is the biggest island in the archipelago, Pemba and Mafia are the other two. And they were often lent credit by Indian merchants who also migrated to Zanzibar. So with this credit, what they would often do is to launch caravans into the interior of Africa, and these caravans typically would go after slaves and ivory. Now, at the beginning, when we get, for example, into the beginning of the 18th century or even the beginning of the 19th century, these caravans were very small, or at least relatively small, and they would only go so far into the interior. But by the time we get to the later 19th century, these caravans could constitute thousands of people, quite literally, and they would go very, very far into the interior. And they would spread the Swahili language often where they went, because Swahili was the language of the Zanzibaris. They were governed mainly by warlords, and one of the most important of these was Tipu Tip. As far as Kongolo is concerned, Sefu bin Hamid, Tipu Tip's son, was one of the most important in terms of giving his allies guns to extort slaves and ivory. So the transformative effects that I note in the book are the fact that rather than chieftainship, the idea of the rule of chiefs over subjects being a process of negotiation and dialogue, what the Zanzibar invasions did was to distort chieftainship into being much more a relationship of coercion and what John Eilif would describe as horizontal lines of honor. That is to say that rather than dialogue, which would be a vertical, it'd be a horizontal line, according to Eilif, rather than being dialogical based on conversation, chieftainship was arbitrary and so vertically aligned, so that people would be given orders and expected to obey them. Now, not only did chieftainship change, but also language changed. So with the Zanzibari came Swahili, as it did over much of the eastern savannah. Many groups, whether they were Hemba, Luba, Songye, or Bangu Bangu, began to speak Swahili, because that was a means of communication across a number of different regions. And it became the language of the political elite. So the Zanzibari invasion was very important in depopulating a lot of Kongolo. So many people would be taken as slaves. They would be sent to bomas. One of the most important bomas would be located in Kasongo, which is north of Kongolo. And these bomas would be fortified, so they'd have fences around them often to make sure that slaves couldn't escape. They were highly militarized, as you can imagine, again, to stop slaves escaping. And these bomas would be the prototype towns and cities in many ways in eastern Congo, because they were areas that missionaries also were interested in going to, because they could then redeem slaves and also convert slaves. So these bomas are very important, but many of the people in Kongolo were forced into them, meaning that lots of depopulation occurred. Equally, this invasion was patchy, and I think this is where I fundamentally disagree with Jan van Sina, who wrote a very important book called Paths in the Rainforests. And in that book, Jan van Sina said that all of the traditions I've noted at the beginning of this podcast were essentially obliterated by the Zanzibari invasion. And if they weren't obliterated then they were obliterated later by Belgian colonial forces. What I say is the Zanzibar invasion was actually patchy, that if you look at the Zanzibar invasion, you can see it very, very strongly in certain areas of Kongolo, but in others very, very, very patchy. And you do have the continuation of a number of traditions, not least in some ways the Luba tradition, and some of the aspects of the Luba royal court were continued under various guises. So while in some places you did have this major change in chieftainship, in others you didn't. And also equally you would have parallel structures where you had a disinherited rural aristocracy, particularly of the Songye, who continued to exist and actually in some cases were enthroned by the incoming colonial regime. So here I'm talking about the so-called tree sultans, the Sultani Yamiti, who occupied sacred groves called hatters, and they are often looked upon as parallel chiefs. And again, that causes problems of authority later on. So in the book, what I try and do is to tease out some of the major changes and continuities once the Zanzibar invasions came in. But I think one thing to end on is the fact that the Zanzibari conception of chieftainship, this very arbitrary, vertically aligned form of chieftainship, dovetailed quite well with the colonial interpretation of chieftainship. And the danger was that Belgian colonial officials believed that's how chieftainship always was, to a great extent, that it wasn't based on dialogue. All of the traditions that I've talked about at the beginning of the podcast meant nothing. It was about a kind of primordial attachment Africans had to chiefs. And that was the big danger that a lot of Belgian colonial officials took on later.
All right, excellent. So let's move into the colonial era and talk about the Congo Free State. Now, to start off with, I think a lot of our listeners will be familiar with this through King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild, and will know about the Red Rubber atrocities. So can you just, Kongolo was not, that was not part of the Kongolo experience, was it?
That is entirely correct. So again, most of the Red Rubber atrocities were concentrated in Western Congo. You could almost draw a line bisecting the Congo Free State into West and East, and the West, broadly speaking, was subject to the horrendous atrocities that Adam Hochschild talks about in King Leopold's Ghost, whereas the East was subject to a massive conflagration, which involved various different actors. And I don't think I've got time this afternoon to talk in depth about what's been called the Swahili-Belgian War or the Congo-Arab War. There are a range of ways of characterizing this conflict between the Zanzibari and the Belgians, who wanted to invade the Congo and to make their conquest manifest. So much of Eastern Congo was up in flames, really, that this was subject to a campaign by the Belgian Gendarmerie, the Force Publique, which was launching campaigns against these bombers, about which I've spoken earlier. So that was, broadly speaking, where Kongolo fitted into the broader pattern of the Congo Free State. And it was outside...
And what time period was that?
Which year are the conflicts?
Yes.
So we're talking about the late 1880s into the 1890s. And the reason I'm being vague here is because the conception at the time was that the Congo-Arab Wars pretty much finished at the Battle of Reuben in the mid-1890s, which is a place in eastern Congo, but further north than Kongolo. But what I want to emphasize to your listeners is the fact that these confrontations between Belgian forces and the Zanzibari continued, and that authority and slaving was very, very difficult to stamp out fundamentally, but also that people didn't just accept Belgian authority after the 1890s. There were continued rebellions. So it's very easy to look at the Congo Zanzibari or the Free State Zanzibari wars as being discrete and being able to be classified into one era of time, but these conflagrations continued to a great extent after the mid-1890s. But broadly speaking, the wars that most people refer to were from around the late 1880s into the early 1890s.
And so the central focus of your book is about two missionary societies, the White Fathers and the Spiritans, and they enter Kongolo around this time, maybe after 1890. So can you talk about the institutional history of the White Fathers and the Spiritans and what led them to reach Kongolo.
Yeah, so first I want to talk about the White Fathers, or the Society of Missionaries of Africa. And it's very important to know that they were created by Cardinal Lavigerie. And Lavigerie was reacting in creating the White Fathers to a cholera epidemic which really struck Algiers as well as a number of other Algerian places in 1867, and he wanted to take care of children who had been orphaned by that cholera outbreak, and so he created the White Fathers in 1868. He also had in his mind the conversion of Muslims in the Maghreb specifically, and he also wanted to start the conversion process of people living in sub-Saharan Africa. So he had a very, very ambitious plan. And I think it's worth saying a little bit about Lavigerie's vision before I continue to link it to Kongolo itself. The first point is that Charles Lavigerie, Cardinal Lavigerie, believed in the idea of civilizing peoples through the creation of Christian kingdoms. And he had a version, or he adhered to a version of medieval European history in which Christian kingdoms were created and civilized Europeans. And that was the kind of model that he wanted to impose on sub-Saharan Africa. So his idea was to create a Christian kingdom in Central Africa, and that is what he sought to set up. And in many ways, what we need to do as historians is to take this very seriously, because he didn't want his Christian kingdom to be part of the Congo Free State. So the fact that it was the product of a deal that he reached with Leopold II and the Pope in the first place. So we need to take this idea of a Christian kingdom very, very seriously. The second point was a much more aesthetic one, and that is to say that the White Fathers are very influenced by where they came from in Algiers. So, for example, they wore white cassocks, which is where they got their name, influenced by the Gandora habit, where the Gandora habit was something the White Fathers modelled their own habits on. So they were very influenced by their own region and by the cultural traditions of the Maghreb. And they came down initially to sub-Saharan Africa in 1876 when they went to Timbuktu, but all of the missionaries involved were killed. But by 1878, they began to make their way into Eastern and Central Africa. And so they started to make their way from Lake Victoria into Eastern Congo, and they wanted to set up their theocracy then in Eastern Congo, because there was really an absence of state presence, and I think that is pretty crucial to talk about. They initially go onto the coattails of the state, and they require really state protection once they start to get past Lake Tanganyika. And they set up a very important base in Mpala, which is on the banks of Lake Tanganyika. And Emile Storms is very important. A Belgian member of the Force Publique is very important in annexing the hinterland around Mpala. So that is, in a sense, how the White Fathers ended up in Eastern Congo. They are led in Eastern Congo by Victor Rollens, very importantly, who is from Ardoy in Flanders. And Victor Rollens was chosen by Cardinal Lavigerie because he was somebody who spoke Flemish, and he was seen by Leopold as somebody who was trustworthy in an atmosphere of intense nationalistic imperial competition. So Leopold II was always paranoid that the colony that he had created, or his fiefdom, would be taken over by the British Empire or by the French Empire. And so what he wanted were missionaries who were Belgian. And he saw Rollens as someone who was Belgian through and through. And this is why Rollens, who was nominated the titular vicar apostolic of Upper Gariba, he was somebody who Leopold trusted wouldn't create a fifth column for the British or the French or anybody else in Eastern Congo. Rollens was very interested in Lavigerie's idea of the Christian kingdom, and he saw himself as the president of a republic, which is his words. And I think it's interesting that Rollens used the words republic, because really he saw himself as a king of a Christian kingdom. So I don't know where his idea of republic came from. But he was very keen to talk specifically about Kongolo. He was very keen to extend the White Fathers' remit outside of Impala, outside of this kind of region that Emil Storms had carved out. And he wanted to set up in a place called Sola, which was in Kongolo. So here we're looking at the east bank or the right bank of the Lualaba River as far as it concerns Kongolo and the Hemba region, so Benenkuvu specifically. So Sola is a place in Benenkuvu. I kind of wish I had a map to show your listeners. I might try and
I think we'll try to link a map when we do the discussion thread.
Wonderful. So Sola was somewhere that was very far outside of the White Fathers' bases, and Rollins was warned not to go there by the Belgian administration because they didn't feel they could protect him and his missionaries if he went there. But he wanted to, because chiefly the Sola region was known to be outside of the geography of sleeping sickness, which was a huge factor in Rollins not staying in the Kasongo, the old Kasongo outstation. So Rollins was very keen to go to Sola. He saw it as an opportunity of expanding the Christian Republic or kingdom, whatever you want to call it. And that is how the White Fathers ended up in Sola in Kongolo in 1909. It was only after really the Depression that the White Fathers moved on to other places as well as Sola. And Sola then for a long time was the White Fathers' main station in Kongolo. And it was staffed by a range of different missionaries, interestingly, all from Flanders. So these are Belgians through and through, and that the idea of that is not that you can't be, but that was how Leopold saw. That was how Leopold saw it. That if you were from Belgium,
they were all Belgians even after the takeover, in turning it into Congo Belge.
I believe so. Yeah, absolutely. So. Whereas the Spiritans, and I can discuss the Spiritans later on, but the Spiritans were often, there are a number of French people in the Spiritan society, but for the White Fathers you do have a very, very big constituency of Belgians specifically. And in fact, when I talk about the Spiritans, they had to realign their perspectives much more in tone with Leopold's wishes than they would ideally have liked perhaps, or that they did initially. A couple of other things quickly for your listeners about the White Fathers. The White Fathers aren't a missionary order as such. They are a society of apostolic life. They retain their own property. Interestingly, they often work in Trinity, so there'll often be 3 White Fathers per mission station. And so that's how often they would run it. They'd have a superior of the station who would typically be the person who authored their diaries. So every day, on pain of sin, the White Fathers would make, or the superior would make a note in their diary, and it's these sources that attracted me fundamentally to the White Fathers in the first place, that these sources actually give you a daily indication of what life was like in the Solar Outstation across the colonial period, and that absolutely fascinated me, and the same is interestingly true of the Spiritans. Now, I don't know if I've got time to talk about the Spiritans. I'd like to say a few words about the Spiritans as opposed to the White Fathers. The Spiritans were founded on Whitsunday in 1703 by Claude Paulet de Place. The Spiritans were founded really as a way of training people from poorer backgrounds to become priests. But the French Revolution put paid to a lot of their ambitions, and so they eventually had to merge in 1848 with the Society of the Holy Heart of Mary, which was founded by Francis Liebermann in 1842. So the Spiritans' second founder is often believed to be Francis Liebermann. Now, the point with the Spiritans is that they were initially actually exiled from the Congo Free State in 1886 because they were assumed to be far too close to the French imperial project. That Philippe Prosper Hogarth, who was key to the Spiritans in Central Africa in the late 19th century, was believed to have collaborated too closely with de Brazza, who was the French explorer, who was actually Italian, but he was supported by the French state. So the point is the Spiritans were exiled because they seemed to be too French, and this is why the person who leads the Spiritans in Kongolo, after the Spiritans were invited back to Congo in 1906, was Emilio Caliwert, and Caliwert was a Belgian. Again, he was trusted by Leopold, I believe, or at the very least he was presumed by the Spiritans to be acceptable to the administration of the Congo Free State and the Belgian Congo. So again, the Spiritans try and get Belgians into their ranks because they believe that if they don't, they might be looked upon with suspicion by the Belgian administration. The last thing I'll say about the Spiritans is the fact that Caluwert in particular followed workers, particularly those of the Great Lakes Railway Company, down the Congo River, and that's how he ended up in Kongolo specifically. So the Congo River played a very important part, as did the Great Lakes Rail Company, because both sets of missionaries feared secularization and Marxism would emerge if there was wide-scale proletarianization of workers in the Congo.
Very interesting. All right, so let's push forward to the Belgian Congo. And in your book, you talk a lot about the attitude of the colonial state towards these local chiefs, and they changed policy several times between World War I and the Great Depression.
Absolutely. So I want to start by saying that initially, obviously, chiefs were looked upon as, when you look at the conquest, chiefs were looked upon with suspicion because they could be centers of resistance. They could be vectors of resistance to the Congo Free State. So many chiefs that could command a great following were defeated in battle, or at least their power was undermined. So what happened effectively, by the time that chieftainship started in Congo in 1891, was when the first decree that Leopold passed to start the process off was passed, with that vast numbers of chieftainships came into existence because very few Congolese people could command a big following. So you had the Congo divided into a myriad of different chiefs, sub-chiefs, as well as Christian villages, and I'm happy to talk about Christian villages later on if you like. This process of creating chieftainships was patchy and incomplete by the time we get into the 20th century. It's important your listeners know that, because you had vast places across the Congo that were not delineated, which had no colonially recognized form of African authority. So the later Free State administration and the incoming Belgian administration got very worried about this, and they wanted to complete this project of recognizing chiefs. So there were decrees passed in 1906, or there was a decree passed in 1906, which again created a plethora of different chieftainships. That was supplemented in 1910 by another decree which further elaborated on how these chiefs function. So really, there were so many chieftainships, many of which were pretty tiny. So after the First World War, the point was that the colonial state, in the form of Louis Frank, who was the Minister of Colonies, wanted to amalgamate these chieftainships and sub-chieftainships to create what he referred to as great chieftainships. And the idea of great chieftainships would be that you'd have somebody like a Malopwe, a Luba Malopwe. Remember that Luba tradition I talked to you about at the beginning of the podcast? Yep. You'd have a grand paramount chief who could command a massive following, and by doing that, not only would you command African respect and legitimacy, but what you'd also do would be to take advantage of economies of bulk. You wouldn't have people who are running different kinds of economic projects across the same region. You'd have someone able to command intensive agriculture. You'd have road networks that could be constructed by simply consulting one person in their court rather than perhaps tens of people. So what you do is to rationalize, to use a colonial parlance, administration by creating these great chieftainships. So there was a huge effort on the part of colonial officials to try and get engaged in ethnography and to try and find these paramount chiefs. And the idea was that these chiefs were there. They had this claim, and the only problem was trying to discover them. Of course, we know that during the conquests that I've talked about, many people were killed. So it's not the case that there were chiefs waiting there who had this great authority and all that was needed was colonial ethnography. In fact, conquest actually meant that authority in the Congo was particularly contested. But nonetheless, Frank believes in this project. His Governor General believes in this project, which is Count Lippens, believed in this project. And so Van den Boogaard, who's a protagonist in the book, wants to find this Luba paramountcy, and he believes he finds it with a chief called Buki in southern Kongolo. Buki, interestingly, was somebody who was believed to have been a ruler of a very small chieftainship during the era of the Congo Free State, and Bugard wants to make him into this big paramount chief and to create this big Buki chieftainship, an amalgamation of a number of different sub-chieftainships in southern Kongolo, and he does this quite coercively, that he makes chiefs symbolically resign their authority in front of Buki, who of course is only too happy in some ways to have his power extended, but nonetheless gets frustrated because the colonial state often tries to undermine his authority, or at least it wants him to do things, and if he doesn't do them, it simply goes ahead and does them itself. But you correctly said that chip changes again, right? So Louis Franck's idea slowly becomes unfashionable, and what the colonial state increasingly wants to do is to move from a kind of British indirect rule. So remember that Franck was a disciple of Lord Lugard. I think he was genuinely sincere when he went to the Royal African Society in London and said, I really like Lord Lugard, essentially. And Lugard, your listeners will know, is somebody who set up indirect rule both in Uganda in the form of the Kabaka, as well as the Sokoto Caliphate in northern Nigeria. Yep. So Franck's idea of following Lugard actually falls out of fashion because the colonial state wants a much more French version of colonial government. And that is to say, it wants to directly appoint chiefs who are loyal to it, but who also are literate and numerate, because it sees in some of these paramount chiefs people who actually may be well versed in terms of the cultures I've outlined, but actually might not be literate and might not be numerate. So their capacity for tax collection, their governance, their loyalty even to the colonial regime is in question. So what the colonial state tried to do was to set up what are called sectors, and sectors were not chieftainships in the sense they didn't have a kind of paramount chiefs. They had somebody who took over who was loyal to the colonial state. And of course, my book says sometimes these people weren't as loyal as the state liked to believe, or at least behaved in ways that were outside of the moral economy of missions, like Rekazi Katore and Kalamba Sindano, we'll talk about later.
Yeah, actually, my next question was going to be about Rasaki Katore and Kalamba Sindano. So can you talk about those two men, a little bit about their biography, and your book really focuses on what you call collaborative competition. And so can you talk about how collaborative competition between the missionary orders and the state was embodied through these two men's experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So Rekazi Katore and Kalamba Sindano were two chiefs who essentially started a witch-finding movement in the 1930s. And I found evidence in 1934 that they had begun a witch-finding movement. So Rekazi Katore was the chief of Benamambwe, and Kalamba Sindano was the chief of Benanyembo. And so these are both Hemba chieftainships on the right bank of the river. Now, the point is, there are several points, but Katore, for example, Rekazi Katore had been a servant living in the pay of an unnamed European settler for a period of 25 years. And just for your listeners, a servant in colonial Congo was described as a boy in parentheses, and many people have seen this as a diminutive title. Many people could have been happy, though, to be boys because it was better than being a slave, which is what some of them have been before, but we don't know that about Katore. Either way, the idea that Katore had been a servant in Congo for a number of years, as well as the fact that he had been a court translator in Albertville, which is now Kalemi, as well as Kongolo, meant that he had demonstrated this loyalty to the regime. He was somebody who was literate, he was somebody who was numerate, and he had invested many, many years in service to the colonial regime. Likewise, Kalamba Sindano took over the chieftainship of Benanyembo in 1923 after the former chief Bititi offered her resignation. And again, that speaks to the patriarchal nature of colonial chieftainship in Kongolo. So both of these chiefs actually were not people that could command a great deal of pre-colonial legitimacy. They didn't have that kind of tie to a pre-colonial myth like Buki did, but they were loyal to the regime, and they were literate, and they were numerate. So they launched this witch-finding movement, I argue in the book, because they wanted to combat sleeping sickness because of the retraction of Western biomedicine in the era of the Depression. So they actually link, I believe, sleeping sickness to the idea of evil, and they launched a witch-finding movement called Kibanjile, which is a word that means a range of different things, which I can go into if you'd like. But the idea of this witch-finding movement would be, I think, to rid these chieftainships of evil, as well as to provide a way of publicly being seen to do so, because I think the problem with Katoré and Sindano was that they were very self-conscious. They knew that they hadn't got this kind of pre-colonial legitimacy, and they wanted to try and legitimize their role to their subjects. And of course, this is within the context of a cotton regime, and the fact that chiefs were people who collected taxes now. So this whole transference from chieftainship from being a very much a process of dialogue to being arbitrary was catalyzing and crystallizing.
It really seemed like they were a point of contact between the state and the people. And so they were in an uncomfortable position as the point of contact.
They're in a very uncomfortable position, precisely so. Yeah, absolutely. And I think this witch-finding movement was initiated in part as a means of trying to bridge the gap, exactly the gap you described, between their role as arbitrary rulers who extorted taxes and labour from their subjects, to try and say to them, actually, no, we do care about you. And I'm going to very publicly, and I talk about the way that many witch-finding trials were conducted on a mound called Agulu Abuti, which is very, very prominent in Benin-Yembo. And that was a way for chiefs to publicly demonstrate their commitment to witch-finding. And this commitment to witch-finding actually fell outside of the moral economy of the White Fathers missionaries, particularly people like Joseph Van den Tillet, who lobbied the administration in the form of Reymenon to try and stop this movement. And of course, Reymenon and his predecessors have taken a gamble on these chiefs, because you weren't really meant to install people in the 1920s who didn't have claims to pre-colonial legitimacy. What you're meant to do is to find people like Buki. Buki was the kind of person who personified the 20s policy of colonial chieftainship construction, whereas Katoré and Sindano were outliers. So the regime gambled on them, and of course it lost, because the White Fathers missionaries were constantly pressing Reymenon to actually unseat, dethrone these chiefs. And the White Fathers eventually won. That in fact, the chiefs were sent into internal exile, what was described as relegation in colonial parlance. So that's where essentially you were imprisoned in another place entirely. And so I believe one of these chiefs was actually sent to Kalemi and imprisoned. And I think actually both of them were sentenced to relegation in Kalemi. And that was where they stayed for at least 20 years or so after these events.
So I want to just dwell on
collaboration. Sorry, collaboration. I forgot you asked me that question too. So what I wanted to say in the book, the overall thesis of the book, essentially, is to challenge those authors such as Madimbe and Crawford Young. So Valentine Madimbe wrote in The Idea of Africa about the very, very close relationship between the Catholic Church and the colonial administration. Likewise, Crawford Young in particular described the relationship between the Catholic Church and the colonial state as seamless. So what I'm challenging in this book is that very idea of a seamless relationship between the Catholic Church and the colonial administration. What I don't want to do is to say there was never any collaboration, because it's evident there was a lot of collaboration. But what I mean to say by this model of competitive collaboration is that they retained different agendas. They retained identifiably very different agendas, and the point with them is that they actually clashed on several occasions. And the idea of Katoré and Sindano being unseated is certainly one of those massive clashes between the colonial state and the Catholic Church. But there are a number of others that I point to in the book. So it's very important to understand that the Church and the state had identifiably different agendas. They worked together in a number of cases, but there are also very, very serious disagreements that they had. And what I do in the book is to talk about this in a local context. So I look at the very, very kind of granular detail of chieftainship, whereas other scholars such as Marvin Markovitz have looked at church-state disagreements in the metropolitan sense. So, for example, in Brussels, where you had big political disagreements between church and state, and that led, in fact, to the end of Louis Francke's reign as Minister of the Colonies.
All right. So I want to go back to something you said a moment ago, that the state was taking a risk in appointing Katoré and Sindano where they should have, quote unquote, they should have found someone like Buki, who was a customary chief, who had this traditional authority. But Katoré and Sindano were in the Hemba area. So was there someone who was available to even fulfill that role, or was the state supposed to look for, what was that sort of an archetype?
That's a great question. So I think the problem with indirect rule, and I think this is something familiar to scholars across Africa, is that if you don't find somebody like a Malopwe, then what do you do? How do you deal with indirect rule with decentralized societies? So Hemba societies were decentralized. I don't like the term acephalous because Hemba societies had rulers of varying degrees of different power, essentially. Mm-hmm. So Hemba was fundamentally decentralized. And that, of course, irked both the Zanzibaris as well as the Belgian colonial officials because they wanted a big Hemba chief, and they created big Hemba chiefs who would typically be fiercely contested. And that was a big problem in Eastern Kongolo because every time a chief was set up as a big Hemba chief, so a big chief of, for example, Benamambwe or Benankuvu, there were serious disagreements because that tradition of a big grand chief of the Hemba didn't really exist. And if it did exist, it was extremely rare in terms of a historical precedent. So in terms of what the colonial regime should have done, the interesting thing was that the idea of the Hemba didn't correspond to Frank's idea of the grand chieftainships at all. That rather the idea of the Hemba corresponded much more, or fitted much more easily into the idea of this vast patchwork of chieftainships and sub-chieftainships. And so what you often saw when the Hemba grand chieftainships were molded together was very, very serious disagreements. So in both of these chieftainships, you had essentially a very, very contested and very conflicted idea of what a chief or who should be chief, and there was great instability, and the Belgian colonial officials constantly remark on the instability, and ironically they're blind to what's causing this instability in the first place, the idea of imposing a tradition of arbitrary rule and of moulding lots of people who weren't actually being ruled by the same person together. So the colonial officials are actually responsible for this, and this is why I think people like Batiti resigned in Benanyembo in 1923, that many Hemba chiefs just think, no, this whole role is completely impossible. And the colonial regime looks to patriarchal reasons why that's the case. So the colonial regime say, but Batiti's a woman, so it can't be done. It looks for every other reason apart from what they're actually doing to chieftainship. So the big problem with indirect rule across Africa was decentralized societies, and how do you actually govern decentralized societies like the Hemba? And to a great extent, what you need is a very, very arbitrary chief and someone who is willing to use violence and coercion to mold people and essentially terrify them into submission. And so again, the colonial officials, blind to their own actually artificial construction of chieftainship, actually critique chiefs for being arbitrary and violent. But in many ways, violence is one of the only things that holds these big chieftainships together.
So I'm going to shift a little bit. So my next question is, in the book, you mentioned the Watchtower Movement several times. Can you just explain what the Watchtower Movement was?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Watchtower Movement was something that was called Kitawala in the Katangese parlance, and it was really a Protestant movement which spread from South Africa through the Copper Belt. So the Copper Belt is an area of copper deposits which stretches from northern Zimbabwe all the way into Katanga. And miners would transfer this Protestant movement up through the Copper Belt and into Katanga. And in Katanga, as I suggested, it got the name Kitawala. So Watchtower effectively, once it became Kitawala, was something that effectively didn't rejected earthly authority, and that's very important to understand. Mm-hmm. So the adepts of Kitawala, they were described as adepts. If you believed Kitawala and you professed Kitawala, you were described as an adept. And the idea was that you rejected taxation, you rejected chiefs, and you rejected colonial labor demands. So as you can imagine, this terrified colonial forces across the Central African Copper Belt and even beyond. So they got to Kongolo, but only in a fleeting sense.
What era was this?
So we're talking about the 1920s when Kitawala comes into Katanga, but really during the Depression you see the regime really paranoid, if you like, about the prospect of Kitawala adepts. So Kitawala really is a product of the 1920s, but it was the fear of it in the 1930s and even beyond the 1930s, which was very, very important. And I want to talk a little bit about why that was. But before I do so, I'd like to say that Kitawala, I don't think, was a proto-nationalist movement. That as much as it rejected colonial forms of authority, it wasn't necessarily something that contained a political program of social change. It was very much based on the rejection of earthly authority and the religious supposition that you could commune with God and create a kingdom of heaven by rejecting earthly authority, but it didn't actually set up a theocracy in the way that Roland's did. It didn't have that necessarily materialist bent to it. But nonetheless, that was how it was interpreted by the regime. So that interpretation mattered in how the regime tried to combat it. So the very process of relegation, which I described happened to Kalamba, Sindano, and Nakazi Katore, was a product of the fear of Kitawala. So what happens when someone was identified as an adept by colonial officials was that they were essentially relegated, and this relegation was supposed to stop Kitawala by isolating adepts, but what it did was in fact to spread Kitawala across the Congo, because if you're being relegated outside, you're actually spreading it outside. So it's one of the ironies of colonial history. Yeah. So the interesting thing with Kitawala, as well as the fact that it actually spread as a result of colonial paranoia, what Nancy Rose Hunt might well describe as a nervous state. So your listeners, I hope, will read Nancy Rose Hunt's A Nervous State book published by Duke University Press, which mentions Kitawala and talks about it a little bit. That's a great book, and you can learn a bit more about it there. But the interesting thing about Kitawala for our purposes is that it's not actually the movement, because if you look at the actual movement, what I found in the archives, you've got very, very little presence of adepts in Kongolo at all. And I counted about 2 or 3, really. So this is a very, very slight phenomenon in its actual materialization. But the fear is something that governs colonial responses to different African cultural expressive cultures throughout, really, the colonial period, only really stopping in the late 1950s. So the fear that you could have Kitawala on the doorstep governed colonial officials' responses to a number of different African expressive cultures, that everything could be Kitawala. It's almost a bit like McCarthyism, you could be Kitawala under the bed, So that was something that I think was very important in shaping colonialism in Kongolo.
And that actually leads right into my next question, which is you write a lot about Wazungu Wejusi, which was a expressive community. So can you tell our listeners what Wazungu Wejusi was and why the colonial state feared that they might be sort of the Watchtower Movement reborn in Kongolo?
Absolutely. So Wazungu Wejusi was a satirical theatre-based phenomenon and was particularly popular in the Hemba chieftainships of Benanyembo, Benankugu, and Benamambwe. So these are the right bank of the Lualaba River. It was first noted in the 1940s by colonial officials, and specifically one of the first references I got was in 1947. So this is a product, in a sense, of the post-war Belgian Congo. It was a movement that I think was part of a wider movement, wider musical movement of the Mucheza wa Tambour dance tradition, which was across Hemba chieftainships. And the Mucheza wa Tambour, so the tambourine dances, essentially, the tambourine theatre, was itself potentially linked to dance movements across Eastern Africa as a whole. So when I'm describing Wazungu Wejusi, I think that some aspects of it will be familiar to scholars who've read, for example, Terence Ranger's Dance and Society in Eastern Africa. So Wazungu Wejusi satirized the colonial hierarchy. So, for example, there would be an African that would represent every aspect of the colonial hierarchy. So someone would be the king. They would be brought in on a teapoy. A teapoy was that thing you used to hoist people above the throng, and that you'd use, and it would be carried. So you'd have a king being brought in on a teapoy, you'd have a governor general, a minister of the colonies, you'd have a colonial administrator. So the point is that Africans, the Congolese, knew about the colonial hierarchy in detail. They knew when someone was being promoted. In fact, the knowledge of the colonial hierarchy, I think, was reflected in just how authentically Wazungu Ayuzi replicated it, that it was extremely accurate, and I think to the extent that it irked colonial officials, that Africans tried very hard to actually get their impressions right. There are a number of satirical shows across the globe, I believe. One of the most famous is Spitting Image here in the United Kingdom, and I think maybe coming across the US. And essentially, Wazungu Ayuzi was a bit of a spitting image phenomenon. It was trying to lampoon the colonial state and trying to make fun of the ways in which it tried to gain legitimacy and authority. It did a number of things, though. I think that it was a rebellious movement, but I don't think it was a hotbed of proto-nationalism. I think that's crucial. The colonial state was very paranoid about it. It believed that it could seriously be a Kitawala prototype, that this lampooning could be a sign of nationalism and rejection of colonialism entirely. That isn't how, when I spoke to former members and people who watched it during my fieldwork, that isn't how it came across. It came across much more as a satirical movement that was far more about entertainment than about creating, again, a program of social change based on nationalist precepts. I don't think it was that. I don't think it was what Eric Hobsbawm has described as a primitive rebellion. I don't think that's right, because this is a very sophisticated movement. And it's worth saying that the colonial officials tried even to change the name from Wayuzi to Wayusti. So, for example, Wayuzi could mean lizard. I think the etymology of Yuzi is potentially contested, but Wayuzi could mean lizards. So Wazungu Wayuzi, the foreign lizards, whereas colonial officials wanted to refer to Wayusti, so white justice in that sense. So the very name was subject to a number of contestations. And so the colonial regime
Usti is not Swahili, though, is it?
No. So it was, in a sense, a failed way the colonial regime tried to impose their own meaning on this movement. But as I've suggested, it was something that was far more about entertainment. And what ironically happens towards the end of the 1940s and 50s is that the colonial regime is worried about it, but not as a proto-nationalist movement, but much more as a disruption to local labour practices. So people would get drunk after performances, and they would be far less willing and far less able to do cotton farming, for example, the next day. So that was why the colonial state was particularly worried about it. The church was worried about it from a moral standpoint, or what they conceived of as a moral standpoint, that it was a site of promiscuous casual sex. And that was something that the church felt acted against the monogamous nuclear family. And so there are a range of different aspects of Wazungu Wayuzi that, as what was known about it, different kinds of concerns were raised. But initially it was thought to be a kind of Kitawala proto-nationalist movement, and of course that wasn't what it was.
All right, so you just mentioned the colonial state's fear that it would disrupt cotton farming. So can you talk a little bit about the economic programs in Kongolo during the Great Depression and into the 1950s, into independence?
Absolutely. So for your listeners, Kongolo wasn't a mining centre. It wasn't somewhere like what is now the province of Upper Katanga that had copper and cobalt. It was somewhere that essentially was an agricultural hub, that it was a very fertile place. It was on the banks of the Lualaba River. And so it started in the 1920s as being a breadbasket, but this then transitioned once the cotton industry took off in the Congo, or was imposed rather. And for more details on this, I'd urge your listeners to read Usama Kalekaka's Rural Society and Cotton in Colonial Zaire. But the idea of cotton as a way of trying to combat poverty in rural Africa and rural Congo specifically was initially conceived of by an agricultural professor called Edmond Leplay in Belgium. So Leplay had a very paternalistic idea of African agriculture, and he believed that in fact what was needed to make money was cotton. And of course African farmers have been making money for many, many years. It's important to say this, that they were sensitive to the market. They grew maize, for example, for internal and regional consumption, but Le Play wanted a cash crop because he believed that vast swathes of the Congo were actually not very profitable, and that best was to have a Congo that was profitable both in the mining centres but also in the rural hinterland. So cotton was a way of making the hinterland and the rural regions of Congo pay, and it was a way of making money and to create ultimately a yeoman class of Congolese who would be loyal to the colonial state because they relied on it for their money, essentially. So Katanga was one of the most important companies founded in 1920, and Katanga owned the majority of shares in Katanga, which was the cotton company which existed in Kongolo, and that was founded in 1933. And this company was, as I say, the company that was most relevant to Kongolo and one of the last of the colonial cotton companies to be found. Now, importantly, the colonial state had shares in this, or there was a very, very tight relationship between these cotton companies and the state. So the administration of cotton plantations and cotton plots was blurred between the state and these companies. So it wasn't entirely clear that Katanga was entirely different from the state. And that's crucial because that means that the colonial state would impose penalties on those who rebelled against the cotton regime. So cotton, for those of you who don't know, is a very difficult crop to grow because it demands a lot of water, it demands a lot of time, and it can be quite temperamental. So lots of African labour was diverted from subsistence to essentially looking after cotton, which obviously can't be eaten and was something that took up space in African plots. So many people didn't like growing cotton. It was hard to grow, and training wasn't necessarily as we would conceive it today. If I was going to take a training session, I might look at a YouTube video, I might go to a class. The agricultural monitors, who were often hired by the colonial cotton companies, were often ex-soldiers who weren't actually that skilled at agriculture. So it wasn't as though many Congolese farmers were getting expert tuition about how to grow cotton. So often they'd have to do it really from trial and error, but this error was misinterpreted as rebellion by the cotton company employees as well as the colonial state. So they were very upset when there wasn't enough cotton produced for the market. So Congolese people initially would actually have their own plots. They would grow cotton as well as whatever subsistence crops they could do, and they would bring cotton to market. And of course, that was essential. They'd get a good price for cotton because that would be their labor for a good proportion of the year. There's a harvest at most maybe twice, 3 times a year. So you imagine only getting paid twice, 3 times a year for a crop that you've spent a year growing or trying to grow. So this was very, very important, and often Congolese people would not actually get a market price for them for various reasons. Sometimes colonial officials may cheat Congolese people out of their wages, but on other occasions the marketing boards, people like Katanga, would say they can't pay full wages because they want to keep some back to make sure they can continue if economic conditions are bad. So exactly as you said, Katanga was actually formed in the Great Depression, so the idea of keeping a reserve was very important for companies such as Katanga because they didn't want to go under if a depression happened again. So either way, there was little monetary incentive, or monetary incentives were limited to grow cotton, and equally it took up space and labour that formerly could have been used for crops like maize, which could be sold but also could be eaten if they couldn't be sold. So cotton was something that was mostly useless and to Congolese people, but of course by the time it had gone out of the ginneries, it could be used to further European fashion markets, Euro-American fashion markets. Now, one of the most important aspects, and I think you talked about this in your introduction to this question, was paysanat indigène, that is a native farmer, if I can use that term in parentheses. And this was a way of, in a sense, collectivizing agricultural labor. So the idea was that you'd have extended kin groups who would work on a plot, and each would hold a title to the land, but the land itself would be blocked out for a cotton planting essential plot. So the idea of this was to gain the advantage of economies of bulk but yet you still have Congolese farmers being invested in it because you had the land title ownership. And this was something that was piloted by Leopold III and was adopted by the agricultural body of the colonial Congo and found its way down into the local administration in the 1940s in Kongolo. Remember that in some ways it's quite ironic because Kongolo was behind, if you look at the foundation of Katanga in 33, it was behind other cotton growing regions of the Congo, but by the time you get to the 50s, Kongolo was viewed on as an experimental hub, that it had a school in Kaseya, which I believe was made in the 1950s, 1955, and it was a place that colonial officials and company officials used to experiment with seeds. So it was actually really on the vanguard of this agricultural revolution that the colonial state wanted to instigate. So it comes from behind, if you like, to take over as a vanguard territory for agriculture. So Congolese people, in a sense, are pressed between these cotton companies and the state as the state seeks to extort as much money as it can to try to, in a sense, make the hinterland pay. And that's balanced on the backs of Congolese people who have to work in often very arbitrary and hot conditions to grow cotton on pain of imprisonment or whipping, and often not getting recompense, not getting remuneration for the labor that they actually invest in cotton.
Turning back to the White Fathers and the Spiritans, one of the things that it seems to make them successful in Kongolo was they provide education opportunities, they provide schools. And so can you sort of connect, how did education create social mobility in Kongolo, and how did that help the residents of Kongolo escape this cotton regime or gain mobility within the cotton regime?
Absolutely. So very early on, the White Fathers and Spiritans want to create schools. And they also want to create hospitals, and we can talk a little bit about hospitals later, although they don't have as much impact on Kongolo as elsewhere. The schools really are fundamental because the idea of schools is to teach literacy to people in Kongolo, because without literacy, people couldn't be catechists and they couldn't convert, because the Bible has to be pretty central, even if the versions of the Bible weren't necessarily translated into local languages until far later on. But literate, numerate catechists were vital in terms of the evangelizing effort of both of these mission organizations. So very soon you get what is called the school chapel complex beginning, and in fact Sola in 1909 was one of the first in Kongolo to do that. Mm-hmm. Now the school chapel system was, as its name suggests, a self-contained community in which people would actually live, and they would attend chapel on Sundays and in worship, but they would also go to school as much as was possible, and they would be trained ultimately in French, although instruction was often in Swahili as the lingua franca of Kongolo from the Zanzibar invasions, as I've suggested. And they would be taught basic theological concepts as well as literacy and numeracy. And for those who wanted to develop their education, they would ultimately be taught French. And there's a very gendered nature to this when I was in Kongolo. And I think even stretching back into the colonial Congo, that it was often boys that parents would push into mission schools and that would be pushed to speak French, whereas girls are less so, because the missionaries, as well as a number of African paterfamiliae, wanted to have a role for women which was very much based on social reproduction and labour. So women often did the most intensive labour in terms of the agriculture, as well as, of course, their role in social reproduction. So schools were divided into a variety of different types of school, and I think it's important to talk to your listeners about that. So the first type of school obviously was an elementary school, and the White Fathers often had elementary schools. Certainly that was the case in Sola, that would create, in a sense, literate people, but not with a specialist understanding of French or theology. But the Spiritans created a Lieberman College, which was known later on in the colonial period as the École d'Apprentissage Pédagogique, or the EAP. And this was where someone I met called Ahuna Marcel, who's sadly passed away now, actually went. So as its name suggests, if you went to a White Father's outstation, you could graduate to St. Augustine's. That's the Spiritan school in the center of the territory. So just to explain to your listeners, Kongolo territory has a headquarter or a capital also called Kongolo. My apologies. So in Kongolo town center, you had St. Augustine's as well as the École d'apprentissage pédagogique. And so you'd start in your White Fathers outstation in Sola. You might, for example, attend elementary school there. And later on, in the 1940s, you might attend a primary school in Benanyembo, in Mbalula, which is the capital of the chieftainship of Benanyembo. You might then graduate onto St. Augustine's and have a secondary education. And finally, you might go to Lieberman College and become a teacher. So in terms of social mobility, what might happen, of course, is you might become a teacher and you would teach at a mission school. And of course, African mission teachers were so vital because they could explain things in local languages. So they could explain something in the Hemba language, Kihemba, or Songhai, or Luba, far better than missionaries, even towards the late colonial period. So there's a very important White Fathers missionary called Joseph de Jaeger, who wrote an ethnography of the Hemba. And he could speak Swahili very, very well. And the people I spoke to in Kongolo actually agreed with this. But he might not speak Hemba. In fact, he didn't speak Hemba. So again, this is something that African teachers could do. So they also take staff positions, or they could staff missions which were understaffed by Europeans. And that way you could expand a mission. So training African catechists to evangelize and training African teachers to engage in pedagogy was considered vital by both the White Fathers and the Spiritans, and they worked collaboratively in Kongolo on this. And there was competition between the White Fathers and Spiritans, at least initially, over who had territory where. So it's important to remember they have distinct agendas, but they did collaborate as the colonial period goes on. And so Africans did actually go betwixt and between them. In terms of agriculture, you raise a very good point there. So my book talks about not only people like Ehuna Marcel as actually being able to become teachers, as well as Tambwe Benoit Abati, who's another person who gets trained by the White Fathers and then actually becomes a colonial administrator or administrator under the colonial regime later on. But there are also people who actually become involved in the agricultural scene after they've been to the mission schools. And so that's very important to mention. So once you become literate and numerate, you can also become involved in the colonial agricultural hierarchies. And I think that's something that is important to point out.
And I think there's also the issue of salaries, where the colonial state is able to pay African administrators, African bureaucrats, less than European bureaucrats. And so the state
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's
100%.
Education.
Absolutely. So that's, again, I mean, you raise a very, very good point, because resources are always tight. I mean, even I think after the Depression, resources are always stretched in terms of missionaries, simply because the demand is there. And one thing to say is that by the time we get past the Great Depression, and even actually by the time we get past the First World War, a number of Congolese realize that the way of becoming a teacher, the way to get out of this brutal cotton economy, is to become a teacher, is to become a catechist, to get into a mission village, or to become part later on, once we get to the first 10-year plan in the Congo, to become a part of this agricultural hierarchy, which is set up to try and instigate and identify plots of land that can be used for the Paysana Indigène program. So there are a number of people who are pushing to get into mission schools, and so the resources are always scarce, and so being able to pay African teachers less is very, very important. And I think that's a very, very good point indeed.
Excellent. And also, you mentioned the gendered nature of education, and there were sister orders to the Spiritans and to the White Fathers operating in Kongolo. And did they also provide education, and were they providing education to women in Kongolo?
Absolutely. So there were nuns. So the Sisters of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, the Sœurs du Cœur Immaculé de Marie, were very important in terms of the Spiritan sister order. They only got into Kongolo in the early 1920s, so their kind of establishment was slower in terms of the fact that they didn't arrive in 1909 with the Spiritans themselves, but they came later. But they set up in Kongolo's town centre, and they do have an important educational impact on women. But remember, I think that female education is considered very different to male education in the sense that women, certainly in terms of the missionaries, were trained not necessarily in as much detail in French, not necessarily in as much detail in literacy and numeracy, but to be good housewives. This idea of middle-class Belgian domesticity, the ideology of this kind of domesticity was very important, both in the context of the colonial state, which launched its, in parentheses, indigenous welfare fund later on, the Fonds de Bien-être des Indigènes, the FBEI, but also to missionaries themselves. So female education, in a sense, would be geared far more to the domestic sphere than it would be to, for example, learning maths, learning the rudiments of French and theology. But it was important nonetheless. And I think one of the things that is very important to point out as a contribution that the nuns in Kongolo made, the Daughters of the Cross from Liège, provided an increasing amount of midwifing services for Spiritan communities in Kongolo. And again, since the 1920s, and this midwifing and the help with maternity was very important in terms of raising or lowering rather the infant mortality rate in Kongolo. So like many different territories across the Congo, you do see the demographics rise. You see a rising population, particularly after the First World War, and in a way, these midwifing services offered by the Daughters of the Holy Cross were a contribution to that lowering of infant mortality.
Excellent. And you just reminded me, so can we talk a little bit about these orders in their role as providing healthcare in hospitals, and what was the role of the respective roles of the White Fathers and Spiritans and the colonial state in providing healthcare in Belgian Congo and Kongolo specifically?
Well, this is a really important question, and here I think is where Kongolo kind of is the exception that proves the rule. Because typically what you'd have are mission hospitals, and certainly that was the case, I think, elsewhere in the Congo. But here in Kongolo, we have a peculiar pattern because it's the state that creates the hospital in the 1930s. Now, that hospital was really for European settlers, so it wasn't used much by Africans, but nonetheless, you have the state creating a hospital, which is very, very strange. What the White Fathers did do was that the White Fathers created a pharmacy. And the idea of a pharmacy was to give out medicine, Western biomedicine, and to try to bring people into the sailor outstation through delivering medical products. Now, it's important to suggest that this was hotly contested, that there were Hemba societies typically constituted of elders who saw their role very much as delivering healthcare. And healthcare was, as is now, very, very respected. And so the capacity to heal, and if you were seen to heal, was seen to be something that actually bestowed a lot of power on you in the community. And again, that's precisely why the White Fathers did it. So there are a range of contests over White Fathers' medicine, but their role was really as pharmacologists or kind of amateur pharmacologists, delivering medicines to people in Benin Kivu and some of their outlying regions. In terms of Kongolo, the Spiritans were less involved in healing than the White Fathers because they were so invested in education. It's difficult to put across just how influential and important their educational facilities were. And I think Lubunda, which is a chieftainship right in the very north of Kongolo, which is the center of Spiritan learning, is one of the centers of Spiritan learning, along with Kongolo's town center, was geared pretty much entirely towards education. So again, this is where Kongolo slightly differs, that's not the case in a number of other territories. In a number of other territories, you'd have a mission hospital and you'd have mission schools. And again, Nancy Rose Hunt's written in her book, Colonial Lexicon, about a mission hospital, this time by the Baptist Mission Society, the British Baptist Mission Society. And that was far more typical, whereas here in Kongolo, you have a far greater emphasis on education than in health, but you do have these very important contests going on in Eastern Congolo, in which the White Fathers are trying to give out medicine and combating elder healing societies to try and do that.
So now I think we're getting towards the end of the colonial era. So can you talk about the late 1950s and sort of set the scene for Congolese independence?
Absolutely. So this is one of my favourite topics. So I'm going to talk in quite broad terms. So do please make me zero in if I need to. But I think one of the points that we need to emphasise as historians is it's easy to see the end as a given. It's easy to see the 30th of June 1960 as inevitable. But what I want your listeners to understand is that it wasn't inevitable, and that it was something that was, even as late as 1955, believed to be pretty much unthinkable. So that's pretty important to say right off the bat. Remember that in 1949, the Belgian colonial administration invests literally hundreds of thousands of francs, perhaps many more, in the Congo to try and intensify industry, to make it more profitable, and to try and use the Congo as a way of rebalancing Belgium's debts after the Second World War. So the Congo is the site of a huge investment in 1949. So it's not at all clear that decolonization is going to happen. And even as late as 1955, Professor Jeff Van Bilsen actually publishes a 30-year decolonization plan for the Congo, and this is lampooned, not because it's too long, but because it's too short. And I think your listeners need to understand that someone who thought that the Congo could be independent in 1985 was seen to be far too radical. And that gives you some indication of just how difficult decolonization would be in the context of the Belgian Congo. A key moment, as I say in my book, was the ascension as Minister of the Colonies of Auguste Buisseret. And Buisseret, like Louis Frank, incidentally, didn't want missionaries to have as much power as they did in Congo. And specifically, Buisseret didn't believe that missionaries actually had the competence to manage education in the entire Belgian Congo. And he made a number of undiplomatic remarks about missionaries, and the Catholic Church got wind of them in 1954 and reacted. And the Church, very much like it did with Louis Frank, gave an ultimatum, or at least contested Buisseret's understanding of their role, and was extremely upset at his characterization of their work. So Buisseret was given an ultimatum that if the cut in funding went through, then all Catholic schools in the Congo would shut. So the Catholic Church delivered this ultimatum, and like Frank, Buisseret backed down and offered a compromise. 45% of state spending on education would go to the state and church schools, with Protestant schools getting the remaining 10% of the colonial educational funding. So you can see there the historic discrimination against Protestants in the Belgian Congo. Leopold II incidentally believed they could be a fifth column for Anglophone influence in the Congo. So the point is that by 1956, the Vatican accepts that African nationalism is legitimate, and the church in the Congo actually starts and accepts the Vatican line, particularly in the context of the school wars. So Buisseret's tenure as Minister of the Colonies is typically characterized by historians as a time of the school wars. And the church essentially fell out with the colonial administration over Buisseret's reforms. That was very, very important. That 1956 is a crucial moment, I would suggest, because for the first time, the church has started to distance itself from the colonial administration, and many looking inside from the outside, believed that this was actually quite fundamental, and this was the beginning of the end for the Belgian rule in the Congo. Now,
I have a question about that.
Yeah, of course, yeah, please.
So your book emphasizes collaborative competition throughout from 1890 up until 1960 in Kongolo specifically. But so you, from what you just said, it sounds like you are holding to the idea that the school war was something qualitatively different from collaborative competition.
Good point. So I think the school war was very much open competition and open disagreement. But I think the fundamental point there, interestingly, and I didn't say this in the book, perhaps I should have done, is that you can see really the level of collaboration that was required by the schism that happened. What I mean to say is that the church splitting off from the administration entirely, or really starting its process of splitting off entirely, reveals the necessity of that collaboration for the fundamental continuity of Belgian rule. So the fact is that there had to be some collaboration. They couldn't just be open competition. And I think once you start to see open competition, you start to see the end of Belgian rule, that colonialism was predicated on collaboration. And once it became too much a question of competition, you couldn't have that colonialism. And so that's how I square that circle in terms of my model. I think all models, in a sense, are like political careers in that they're doomed to failure. And so I don't think any model can completely capture every aspect. But I think that's how I'd scramble to defend the model in that sense.
Okay, now, no, that helps clarify for me.
Thank you. So coming to decolonization then, again, in 1957, there were local elections. These were mostly meaningless. They didn't carry any kind of power. Executive power was still fundamentally centered on Brussels. And by Christmas 1957, 1958, political parties were legalized. And I think that's another crucial step. Now, Belgium legalized political parties not because they wanted to, but because they felt that they could distort the process. They could buy off opponents. That they could produce marionettes, African marionettes who would simply say, we just want to create a kind of Belgian community to fudge decolonization, essentially. And so that was the idea Belgium had by legalizing political parties. What they didn't anticipate was that these political parties would eventually lead the Congo to decolonization. And this leading to decolonization, in a sense, happened much more as a result of the Leopoldville riots in January 1959 than anything else I can say.
Leopoldville is Kinshasa now.
That's correct. Yeah, Leopoldville is Kinshasa now. And from the 4th to the 9th of January, I believe, you had a series of riots which were predicated on the fact that a political party had been stopped from meeting, that is to say the Bakongo Alliance under the stewardship of Joseph Kasavubu, who interestingly wanted to stop this meeting. Kasavubu wanted to stop his own party's meeting after he got wind that the Israeli officials would shut it down. What Kasavubu didn't anticipate was that 20,000 football fans were pouring out of the stadium, and I read Tropical Cowboys by Didier Gondelier, and Gondola makes the point that the team had lost, so that's why the fans were particularly upset. Yeah, fantastic work. And Gondola makes the point that the fans had witnessed their team lose, so they're even more upset. So if you can imagine soccer fans had seen their team lose, pouring out onto the street, and they, seeing Bako's meeting being broken up by colonial forces, then started to rebel. And you've got really the beginning of a colonial, anti-colonial insurrection occurring. And I think the Belgian forces were very, very afraid that they could have an Algeria on their hands or a Kenya. So for your listeners, Algeria, of course, had a very brutal anti-colonial war from 1956 to 62. Likewise, Kenya from 52 to 60 fought a range of fought the Mau Mau. So there were a range of there's a feeling in Belgium that they didn't want to fight, particularly if the church wasn't going to be on their side, if business was making much more of an effort to try and be accommodating to Africanization of the hierarchy. They believed that they had to negotiate some kind of ending. And so the idea was in January and February in 1960 to try and agree on a settlement for the decolonization of the Congo. And in fact, I should say, rewind and say that in 1959, after the Leopoldville riots, a commission was appointed by Baudouin, who was the then King of Belgium, and that recommended, in parentheses, I think it was a considerable amount of internal autonomy, or the Congo should have internal autonomy, and that's kind of fancy administrative speak for independence. So given this report coming out in 1959, 2 round tables were convened in 1960, one for the economic settlement and one for the political settlement. The upshot was that there's a general election in 1959, and we know, of course, that that general election was won by the National Congolese Movement, the MNC, that was headed by Patrice Lumumba, and Abako, Joseph Kasavubu's movement, actually got a lot of votes, and so they formed a coalition with the MNC. So Joseph Kasavubu was president of Congo, Patrice Lumumba was the prime minister, with the prime minister having a far greater role in proposing legislation than the president. We know that on the 11th of July 1960, Moise Tshombe would declare that Katanga would be a separate state from the rest of the Congo, and crucially, Katanga contained much of the Congo's mineral wealth. And Tshombe's secession had been triggered by the mutiny of the Force Publique. So the Force Publique had been told by its general, Emile Janssens, that before independence would equal after independence. And George and Zogologa and Talaja, in a great biography, a short biography for their higher African studies series, they said that it could be that Janssens was deliberately being pig-headed to upset Lumumba, to try and shape Lumumba's role, which I think is an interesting interpretation. In being completely pig-headed, we don't know, but what we do know is that the Force Publique mutinied, and Tshombe said that he was seceding from chaos on the 11th of July 1960, and that triggered the Katanga secession, and that was absolutely crucial to what would occur later. And I think one of the most important triggers and the most important aspects of the Katangese secession, and in fact the Kasai secession in August 1960, was the beginning of the end of Lumumba's rule. That we know that Lumumba acted through Joseph Mobutu, who headed up the Force Publique, which was called the National Congolese Army, basically committed an act approximate to genocide, I think was the word that Dag Hammarskjöld used, the phrase he used, against the Luba of Kasai, and Lumumba was actually placed on house arrest after that and unseated by Joseph Kasavubu, and that was, of course, the beginning of the end for Lumumba. So the Congo had a very, very, very sudden decolonization process that, without the Leopoldville riots, it's very hard to see how decolonization would have happened in quite the way it did in the Congo. And really, the settlements were created very, very quickly in the Plaza Hotel in Brussels, I believe, in these round tables. And really, it was unsuitable for the huge complexity which actually was necessary to try and maintain the Congo as an integral state. And we know that the Congo fragmented very soon after decolonization.
Right. And so to Katanga secession, I think a lot of our listeners will have a perspective coming from the United States, coming from the great power Cold War perspective, seeing it as a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. But your book really stresses the local aspects and the people of Congolo's reasoning for voting for Moise Tshombe's party in the 1960 elections and for supporting secession.
Absolutely. So I follow along with the work of Miles Lama and Eric Kennis and a range of scholars who've said that the Katangese secession really needs to be understood not just as a question, or not as a question of African marionettes being puppeted by Belgian colonial forces and other kind of imperial forms of intrigue. Although we need to understand that there was great involvement of Belgium and Belgian people within the Katangese secession. We need to understand that certainly, that the Constitution of Katanga was written by a Belgian, and Belgium was representing Katanga to the United States. And so there was a great degree of Belgian involvement. But what was crucial to understand is that there were also other reasons why people supported the Katangese secession and why the Katangese secession did gain some African support. So one of the most important points about it was that many actually were afraid of Lumumba's ideas and his socialism, because they feared that, having worked so hard, so someone like Ahuna Marcel, who had worked so hard to get up into the teaching profession, feared that what Lumumba would do would be to sweep away all mission influence, to kind of follow a Buisseret line, to kind of completely divest from missions, to disempower missions. And so Ahuna Marcel's kind of path up would be kicked from under him, so perhaps his children and perhaps his friends wouldn't be able to take the same kind of route to social mobility that he did. He feared that Lumumba would be a socialist, like even somebody like Stalin, I mean, we can contest whether Stalin was a socialist or what, but the Lumumba could be a dictator in waiting, that this could be very, very serious, and that the degree of any kind of freedom you could have from decolonization might be compromised by an overarching, unwieldy, monolithic Congolese state, which wouldn't actually take into account different African traditions, the like of which I'd actually talked about at the beginning of the podcast. So there was a great degree of fear. There's a question that actually, as racist as the hiring policies in the Belgian Congo could be and were, that actually that was the problem, is the racism of the hierarchy is what was called at the time a color bar, and what we now understand just purely as racism. That was the problem. So once you got rid of racism, actually the idea of capitalism wasn't so offensive, and that many Africans wanted to maintain, for example, the Great Lakes Rail Company, and wanted to carry on with forms of administration such as the territorial official structure that Tambwe Benoit Abati was actually leading in Kongolo by the time that the 1960s came about. So the idea of a wholesale radical socialist vision of decolonization was actually quite frightening to someone like Ahuna Marcel and Benoit Tambwe Abati, who I talk about in my book. They wanted an end to racial discrimination, but they didn't want an end to capitalism. And they saw in Tshombe a way of trying to maintain their social mobility, their roles, what they'd achieved under colonial rule, rather than that all being swept away.
And in your book, Tambwe Abati and Ahuna Marcel were educated at these Catholic mission schools, but in the book you mentioned Jason Sendwe of Balubakat was educated at a Protestant school in Kasai, I believe. And so can you talk a little bit about the how education influenced political radicalism?
I think this is a really crucial point, and I'd love to do more research into this. So what I'm going to say, I think, needs to be caveated by the fact that to some extent I am speculating, but you're right. I think there is a schism in the sense that you have many nationalistic figures who have at least some Protestant education. So Jason Sendwe leads the Baluba Association of Katanga and was actually schooled by American Methodists who had a very tortured relationship with the Belgian colonial administration. And so at times they would try and ingratiate themselves, at other times they would try, or they found themselves simply at loggerheads with it because they believed, quite correctly, I think, that it discriminated against them and that they were subject to discrimination because they weren't Catholic. So Sendwe would be schooled by people operating at a distance from the colonial state, and his frames of reference would be, he would certainly have American frames of reference in his mind. So his idea of a Belgian colonial administration continuing, he wasn't so attached to that, and he certainly wasn't so attached to Catholic mission education. And I think that the point that I made earlier in the podcast was that Protestant subsidies on behalf of the state were actually far, far less and far more infrequent than the Catholics were. So the idea of a world which wasn't actually reliant on the Belgian colonial administration, that wasn't reliant on the Catholic Church, was certainly something that Sendwe could understand far more and actually be far less about than somebody like Ahuna Marcel or Benoit Tambwe Abati, whose entire, quite correctly you said, entire education experience had been with Catholics. And it's important to remember that you still have people like Lumumba who had both. So Lumumba was trained by both Catholics and Protestants. But I think that Protestantism was very important, particularly for someone like Sendwe, who was very ethnocentric in his politics. That is to say that he had a conception of the Luba. He published his own version of the Luba Genesis myth I talked about in the beginning of this podcast. And this kind of ethnocentrism and teaching in the language of the Luba was something that the Protestants did very much because of the centrality of understanding the Bible to their forms of worship. So the Protestants would be in many ways ahead of the game with translating Luba proverbs. So William Frederick Padwick Burton was very important in translating Luba proverbs. Likewise, the Luba Catechism was something that was very, very important. I mean, it's important not to place too much emphasis on this distinction between Protestants as being ardent linguists versus Catholics who weren't, because there were lots of Catholics who were. Jean van der Meuren, for example, was very important in terms of my area and translating a lot of local languages as well. But certainly this idea of Protestantism and a Protestant mission press being slightly separated from the colonial state, and sometimes very separated, was important, I think, in facilitating an imagination that could cope with the end of Catholicism in the Congo and an end to the Belgian colonial administration. So I think there was that imaginary which was quite different. And I think versus someone like Ahuna Marcel and Tambwe Benoit Abati, whose whole life really, Ahuna Marcel had travelled many miles by foot to try and get to Lubunda and train himself. He was somebody who really was hostile to anything that threatened Catholicism being prevalent in the Congo for decades to come. So I think there is certainly something to the difference in people's political outlooks being formed in a way from their religion, but I think we need to be careful about overstating the difference here, because, as I say, you have people like Lumumba who are schooled by both and who still turn out to be one way or the other, in Lumumba's case, are more radical. So not everything can be explained by religion, but I think we need to take it into account, and I think it does account for the perspectives of those who followed a CONICAT path during the decolonization phase.
Certainly sounds like something that bears further research. So I want to keep on with Jason Sendwe and the Balubakat. So can you talk about the role of the Katanga Luba in the Katanga secession and how that reaches Kongolo?
Yeah, so I might do a plug if that's all right. I will have an article coming out in the Journal of African History about Sendwe and exactly the question that you asked. So if people are interested to learn more, do keep your eye on the Journal of African History, as there'll be an article appearing about this issue in depth. So just to say that Sendwe had an idea of the Balubakat, and he had an idea of himself as Luba royalty. So he saw himself as somebody who could shepherd the Luba community towards independence. Now, this idea of shepherding towards independence and what vision that would take changed quite differently depending on the political circumstances of the time. What I want to say is that initially Sendwe saw himself as fitting within Chombei's Confederation of Katangese Tribes, or CONICAT, because he saw the Luba as a Katangese tribe, and this was juxtaposed to the Luba Kasai, who, as their name suggests, were identified as not being authentic Luba Katanga. So there was this disparity, and the Luba Kasai were important in our story because they were seen to be taking the jobs and political roles that many Katangans believe should be theirs. So CONICAT was
because they were moving into Katanga.
Sorry?
Because the Luba Kasai were moving into Katanga to work in the mines?
Precisely, absolutely, yeah, that's exactly true. So CONICAT were formed in a way, not just as a kind of separate project, but to try and block out Luba Kasai immigration into Katanga. So Sendwe sees himself and his Luba Katanga as being disadvantaged slightly by this Luba Kasai immigration, and so he's happy to sign up with CONICAT, but where he kind of diverges from them is that he sees them as being too dominated by European settlers who formed this kind of association called the Katangese Union, the Union Katangais, which ironically is the same as UK. For me as a UK subject, that's quite interesting. So Sendwe sees Chombei as being in the control of European settlers and the European mining industry, particularly the Mining Union of Upper Katanga, or the UMHK. So increasingly Sendwe takes Balubakat out of the CONICAT, and he begins to fight elections on his own, although he has to go into a coalition eventually because he basically doesn't have the votes to try and to get the power that he wants. So initially he seeks to attach his Luba to various constituencies such as the Chokwe Association to try and forward the Luba perspective within the decolonization process. And eventually, when decolonization happens, Balubakat is very close to the national Congolese movement under Lumumba. So he is a Lumumbist, and he sees himself as acting against the secession, and that's quite crucial because the Balubakats contain a range of different people with different political perspectives. Some, like Prosper Mwamba Lunga, as being very different to Sendwe that Ilunga is much more radical than Sendwe, and you now know where the name Ilunga comes from, right? It comes from the Luba Genesis myth. So the secession really cements Balibakat in a party that is coherent under the leadership of Jason Sendwe, who actually becomes deputy prime minister for a time under Lumumba because he doesn't want to be too far away from Katanga because he fears that he could be ousted actually as the president of Balibakat by people like Ilunga who are more radical. A crucial moment comes in 1961 when, of course, Lumumba is assassinated. So Patrice Lumumba is assassinated in January 1961, and what that means is that the central state is seen to have less legitimacy under Joseph Elio, who's the person who takes over from Lumumba. That means that the Balibakat form a separate polity entirely. They form the Lualaba province, which is a Baluba province. And this is impacts on southern Congolo specifically because that is the Luba area. And it has great effects because what that means is that if you're not Luba and you exist in this province, you are subject to death, essentially. And Huna Marcel told me about the impromptu language test which would happen. So you could be stopped anywhere in Kongolo, particularly in the south, and you'd be asked a question in Luba, Kiluba, to distinguish it from Chiluba, which is the Luba Kasai language. You'd be asked a question in Kiluba. If you didn't understand the question, you'd be presumed to be an enemy of the Lualaba province, and you could be killed right then and there, summary execution. So it's a very frightening time. Equally, Huna Marcel talked about bars. So, you go into a bar for a drink. You might talk about Konakat. It might be obvious to the bar people serving you that you are, in fact, a Konakat sympathizer, and you could then be targeted for execution. So it was a really, very, very frightening time. This Lualaba province was extremely militant, but I think we have to understand it in the context of the secession. The Lualaba province, which encompassed most of what is now Tanganyika, the Tanganyika province, and what was then northern Katanga, the Tanganyika province, the Lualaba province, was a means of fighting the secession. And there were a number of what we would understand today as guerrilla warfare, that the Katangese army, when it was finally mobilized, was far better armed, far better trained, and was able to take out many Luba guerrillas. But crucially, its resources were concentrated towards the south because that's where the mining interests were. So some of your listeners might have seen the siege of Jadotville, for example, in which an Irish battalion of UN forces were charged with protecting a particular place that was close to the mines. That was where a lot of Tshombe's army was concentrated, so it didn't actually get that far north. So you'd have skirmishes, you'd have these kinds of skirmishes, but actually, to a great extent, it was the Luba forces of Balibakat which controlled much of the north for much of the time. So the Katangese secession really only applied to about a third, which is the southern third of Katanga. Much of the hinterland was outside of the actual domination of the Katangese state. So that was something I think that is worth mentioning. And so Sendwe had this conception of what it was to be a Luba, but it's worth saying that Sendwe was being driven by some of the radical currents in his party, like Prosper Mwamba Lunga, who wanted a very, very militaristic, radical socialist version of a Luba ethnopolity. Sendwe was actually far more accommodating to industry. I think Sendwe realized that you need railways, you kind of need you need commerce to make a state viable, whereas Ilunga was, if anything, has any kind of capitalistic bent to it, then it's not really decolonization. Ilunga's decolonization was far more radical. So Sendwe had to kind of balance both of these constituents. He had to kind of balance the Ilungas, who are very, very radical, and he had to balance an increasingly capitalistic Leopoldville or Kinshasa. And we know that Joseph Kasavubu was president throughout the First Republic, and you had Cyril Adula in charge for much of the secession, who was, while nominally on the left, he was actually far less radical than Lumumba had been. So Sendwe has to balance between these constituencies, and he ultimately fails. We know that he falls in 1964 and is assassinated in mysterious circumstances. But the crucial point is that the secession fails on the 21st of January 1963, by which time the Lualaba province is disbanded because you have, in a sense, you have the reunited Katanga. But all of this turbulence is witnessed firsthand by a number of missionaries, and specifically the Spiritans, 20 of which died in a massacre which took place on the 1st of January 1962, and I can talk about that in more detail if you'd like.
Yes, please.
So I think one of the crucial points that I made in the book was that rather than the colonial state and its administrators often just go once it's clear that the decolonization happens, although some do stay. So for many in Bali-Bakat, it was absolutely awful that you had colonial officials staying on after 1960 to take part in the separate Katangese project. But many colonial officials left in 1960, and this was something that was noted by the church, but the church wanted to stay, and I think that's a crucial point. The church saw itself as a triumphalist institution that was going towards very big evangelization, and of course it didn't want to undo all the work it felt it had done throughout the entirety of the colonial period. So the Spiritans are, in particular, are tortured about whether to stay or whether to go, and I think they have a very big problem because a number of people start to take refuge in their outstations, and they start to come in. There's lots of refugees coming across to try and escape the violence, particularly of the Jizengist forces. So Antoine Gizenga, who was Lumumba's deputy prime minister, forms a breakaway province in 1962, and particularly actually as early as 1961, after Lumumba's assassination, and sends troops in to try and take back Katanga from the secession. So he sends troops in, and before these troops come in, floods of people are coming into the Spiritans. The Spiritans see their role not only as staying to protect their own gains, but also to look after refugees. And they have a huge debate as to whether they stay or whether they go. They know that the Jizengist forces are coming. They know that the secessionist forces are on the back foot by 1961. And they're much more concerned, the secessionist forces, with maintaining their position within the mining centres. And they decide to stay. And they effectively, when the Jizengist forces come in, they're joined, the Jizengist forces, by Bali-Bakat, who identify the Spiritans as collaborators with the secessionist projects. And crucially, there was a Spiritan, Jules Damont, who was a chaplain to the Katangese army. And so the connection between the Spiritans and the Katangese army is through Jules Damont, who is ironically, never died. Jules Damont actually was away from the Spiritan seminary in Kongolo town centre when the 20 Spiritans were actually picked up by the Jizengist forces and the Bali-Bakat sympathisers. So I think we all never know, because there was never actually an investigation into these deaths, and it's regrettable there wasn't for a number of reasons. But the point was, I think that there were Bali-Bakat militants, and the Spiritan sources talk about them as being drugged, or they had actually imbibed a lot of drugs, marijuana particularly, and this is what drove them on to commit acts of brutality. But as well as the Jizengist forces came in, looked at the passports of the Spiritans, and the point I make in an article in the Journal of Social Sciences and Missions is it wouldn't prove anything. Having a passport wouldn't prove you're a collaborator or otherwise, but this was perhaps just a ritual they went through to try and justify what they were doing. They took the Spiritans on New Year's Eve to the military camp. The Spiritans were repeatedly brutalized, and it was interesting the brutality the Spiritans experienced. They were whipped, many of them with a chikot, which is a hippopotamus hide whip, in a way that kind of reversed the colonial violence that many had experienced. So the hippopotamus hide whip was used to whip those who hadn't produced their quota of cotton. It was used to whip those in prison, replete across the Belgian Congo, the chikot. And now it's being used to whip priests. So this is a complete turnaround. I don't think it was clear what was going to happen to the Spiritans that night. I think there was a lot of debate. Obviously, there were debates, should you kill priests? It's a huge question. And I think that the aggressors were thinking that they could strike a blow against the Katangese secession by killing the priests. They thought they could be funneling arms. They could be doing anything to help the secession. So they believed they were striking a mortal blow against the secession in Kongolo, and that would mean that they could then move forward into central and southern Katanga. We know that they really weren't. The Spiritans may have been providing homilies for the Katangese army, but I don't think their collaboration meant anything more than that. So But they were killed on New Year's Day 1962. And I think the way that they are described, we need to be careful about the way, because we only really have Spiritan sources for this particular event. And I think the Spiritans really looked at this through the frame of martyrdom, that the Spiritans didn't seek death, that they were, and I don't think they did. I think there's evidently a lot of fear among the Spiritans before they actually were killed, and they were marched to the banks of the Luba River that was in the military camp on the outskirts of Kongolo town centre, and they were gunned down by rapid fire semi-automatic guns, I think, and their bodies were flung into the river. So it was a really disturbing scene. I've spoken to a seminarian who was jailed as well, but who wasn't killed, who witnessed this. So this has produced a lot of trauma, but it's a way in which
I imagine.
So I do carry on.
I'd imagine it would cause a lot of trauma.
Absolutely. And I think, as well as causing trauma, though, this is a way that the Spiritans could look at the colonial period that de-emphasized their collaboration with the colonial regime. So when you go to the central church in St. Joseph, the St. Joseph district of Kongolo now, you can see the Mashairi wa Kongolo, the martyrs of Kongolo. And I believe that the official process of beatification has begun, that Bishop Oscar Mpando has actually started the process of canonizing these 20 Spiritans. And rather than remember the collaboration and some of the facets of the more uncomfortable facets of the colonial regime in Kongolo, what's happening now is that the memory of the Spiritans is only the Spiritan martyrs. And those are now, they're informal martyrs. Now they may well become formal martyrs when the process is completed of canonization, if it is completed. So really, I think that that's one way of institutionally remembering the colonial period for the Spiritans. But yes, it certainly has caused trauma. But the interesting point is that rather than the early 1960s, when this event was big news, I mean, this was something that was broadcast across the world and was something that was very, very famous. Rapidly, it became less significant in terms of its coverage, and people forgot about these martyrs. And so I think that there was a process of remembering which began really in the 60s with the construction of a chapel in Jontigny in central Belgium. And Jontigny, rather than just a place that the Spiritans could remember the 20 who died, has become a place that is there to remember all of the clergy who died, I think even Protestant and Catholic, who died during the First Congo Republic from 60 to 65.
Okay. So does the Kongolo massacre represent sort of the tail end of European missionaries in Kongolo? And does the Catholic Church sort of shift to much more African priesthood and African institutional hierarchy in Congo and in Kongolo specifically?
So in 1959, you have the raising of the Vicariate Apostolics of Baudouinville and Kongolo, two dioceses. And so this is a sense starting the process of creating dioceses in Kongolo so that are less, if you like, dependent on the mission infrastructure that they were before. So 1959 is a very, very key year. The Kongolo massacre, in terms of the Spiritans, means that the African hierarchy, there has to be some Africanization of the Spiritan hierarchy, even if that's de facto, not necessarily de jure. So Monsignor Ndai actually only takes over much later on as Bishop of Kongolo, but he's effectively takes on a huge role. One, Gustave Bouve actually spends a lot of time in Belgium during the latter phase of his rule in the 1960s. So Gustave Bouve actually takes a lot of time out of the Congo and spends a lot of time in Belgium. And he actually resigned in 1970, and that's when Monsignor Ndai took over as bishop. The process of transferring the hierarchy to being a much more African hierarchy is more pronounced in the White Fathers. So after Urban Etienne Morlian resigned in 1966, Joseph Songolo Mololwa took over as bishop. And after, I think it was 1972, with the Authenticité campaign, so we can talk a bit about Mobutu later on, the Bodouinville diocese was renamed Kalemi Kirungu. So you'll know that Mobutu wanted much more traditional African names, or he conceived of as traditional African names, rather than the names which actually have their origins in Europe. So Bodouin, named, of course, after the African king Bodouin. So Kalemi Kirungu became the diocese of Bodouinville. And so with Malolwa and Ndai, you have an Africanization of the hierarchy, but that Africanization, I would suggest, had happened de facto anyway, given the fact that European priests, and so many European priests and 2 European brothers, had been killed during the Kongolo massacre. And I think the Kongolo massacre sped the effective Africanization, even if it didn't necessarily speed the kind of formal process of enthroning Monseigneur Ndai and Joseph Sondolo Malolwa. So I think the answer to your question is yes, it certainly sped it, even if it was later in the 60s and very early 70s that you had African bishops heading these dioceses.
Okay. Right. And I would like to talk about the Mobutu era and what was the relationship of the Catholic Church to Mobutu and vice versa.
This is a fantastic question, and I think we're still finding out more every day, but very simply put, in fact, you have Mobutu acting much like Louis Frank and Bouisseret before, because Mobutu wanted to nationalize church schools, particularly in 1973 under his authenticité drive. So again, authenticity is the idea that Mobutu wanted to have more Africanization in public life in the Congo, although interestingly, his schools still taught in French, so there weren't necessarily African languages being used in Congolese schools during authenticité. Likewise, Mobutu emphasized Zaireanization, which was nationalization. So again, this corresponded with his drive to try and co-opt mission schools into the ambit of the state. So Mobutu decided that even crucifixes should not be placed in any public building from around 73 to 74. This process of the nationalization of mission schools had begun actually even earlier than 73. If you look at Luba University in Kinshasa, as is now, this was a mission facility, the Catholic University of Leuvenham, but this was nationalized in 1971. So Mobutu, much like his colonial predecessors, interestingly, wanted to take over mission schools and didn't want missionaries to be actually heading schooling in the Congo. Much like in 1954, in 1975, the church threatened to take all teachers out of schools. And so we know that the Catholic Church responded very much like it had done in the past. And this, again, shook Mobutu's ability to try and nationalize all of mission schools, and ultimately it didn't work. We know that the Zairean state also lacked the funds to actually administer education after the fall of copper prices in 1975. So those of your listeners who studied the mining industry in Congo and generally development in Congo will know that when the Vietnam War started to come to an end, copper prices crashed because so much of the Congo, or Zaire after the 70s as was. So the Zaire is the name of the Congo during the reign of Mobutu, I think from 71 to 1997.
97, yeah.
Exactly, and so Zaire didn't have the money to take over mission schools, it didn't have the money to pay teachers, and so effectively it couldn't actually execute Mobutu's plan of nationalization. And this is why today you still have a number of church schools in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and you have church schools in the latter part of the lifetime of the state of Zaire, because it simply didn't have the money to fulfill Mobutu's project, even if the political will was there, it just didn't have the funds to do it. So Mobutu seriously kind of clashes with the church. There are a range of criticisms the church levied on Mobutu. And so in many ways, ironically, the Catholic Church, became far more popular than, for example, Kimbanguism. Kimbanguism after Simon Kimbangu in the 1920s, who formed his own Protestant religious movement, the Church of Simon Kimbangu. Because Kimbanguism was associated with authenticity and Mobutu, whereas the Catholic Church distanced itself and was distanced from the state because of, among other things, Mobutu's hostility to its monopoly of education.
So I want to shift topics and talk more at a meta level about the process. What was the process like writing this book? What sort of sources did you consult? It sounded like you were talking about the records of the White Fathers and the Spiritans, and did you do oral history interviews in Kongolo?
Yeah, so I'd say first and foremost to any early career scholars listening to this that the book took a long time, and I think it took a long time to get into print. So I'd say that writing a book, if you're feeling like you're the only person who has difficulty writing a book, that's not true. I think I certainly had a great deal of difficulty writing this book for a number of different reasons. So it's definitely difficult, I think, to get a thesis that runs through an entire history of colonialism. And it's certainly difficult to get an original thesis because I think we know really how awful Belgian rule could be. And so it's difficult to get a coherent thesis to run through the history of this book. So that was the first struggle, and there are a number of struggles. But in terms of the sources, I'd say that mission sources were fundamental to this project because they could shed light on social dynamics that were not there in the colonial archives. So the mission diaries that I mentioned in the first part of this podcast were fundamental to getting a sense of how life was in, for example, Sola on a day-to-day basis. The Spiritans also kept these diaries, though it doesn't seem as diligently as the White Fathers. And equally, the Spiritans are only just now in the process of typing up their diaries. So I had to kind of painstakingly go through handwritten diaries in the case of the Spiritans, whereas in the case of the White Fathers, they've actually typed up their manuscripts. So those are actually far more accessible. Likewise, the Spiritans and the White Fathers wrote ethnographies, although the White Fathers seem to be far more keen to publish their ethnographies than the Spiritans. So Joseph de Jager's work, for example, was crucial for me on gaining a handle on the Hemba societies. So the White Fathers' ethnography is very important. I'd say also the colonial archive, so the annual reports of the colonial state were very important because they tell you what the state was doing and the kind of ways in which the state saw local societies. Obviously, there's so much I could talk about with the state archives. They are, in many ways, worth a book themselves. So one of the things that they don't do is talk about the violence very much. Mm-hmm. They euphemize the violence that they imposed on Congolese societies. So one of the ways in which they do this, I think I mentioned this in the book, is to talk about persuasion. So people are persuaded to do something. So it makes it look as though colonial officials are there kind of in a Socratic dialogue with African societies, whereas the reverse is true, that they are coercing them. And the stories that I heard in my oral research are terrifying. And so that's very, very important. And oral research was crucial to the book. It was very difficult to start with because essentially there aren't that many people who remember the colonial period, and equally people want to talk about the present because when I went to Kongolo, as you can imagine, I went there first in 2008, so we're not too far away from the Congo Wars. I can talk about them in detail if you'd like. We're not too far away from them, so the urgencies of the present were weighing heavily on the field work, that people wanted to talk about their lives, and they wanted help for the conditions that they live in now. And of course, these still continue to haunt me, and I try to think of ways in which my research could be of use in that sense. So it's very difficult to get people to talk about the colonial period. Likewise, when people did talk about the colonial period, they often would talk in episodic fashion. So there are certain episodes that meant a lot to them, and lots of it they couldn't remember. So there was a cross between some of the things I wanted to talk about, like chieftainship, and some of the things they wanted to talk about. So mobility was very important. I think the idea of getting out of chieftainship, using a pass to get out of chieftainships, and trying to organise those kinds of things. Equally, people wanted to press their own kind of fame, or they wanted to need to kind of act as a hagiographer in some cases. I won't mention any names, but the people wanted me to kind of be a hagiographer to some degree. So there are all kinds of interesting problems that fieldwork threw up, but it was fundamental in terms of gaining an understanding of the daily colonial state.
Was there a gender dynamic on who was available for you to interview? I didn't notice female. Can you talk about
absolutely. That? I mean, absolutely. And this is something that's really, really tough because for a person outside a society, particularly outside many Hemba societies, you can't really speak to a woman on your own. So you speak to a woman in company. You have to speak to a woman in company. And what I did when I was doing field, I did speak to a woman, and it was a fantastic discussion in some ways, but a very frustrating one in others, because when this woman tried to speak, the men tried to ventriloquize her. So when I spoke, it was a man who answered, even though I was facing her and I sat opposite her. Men tried to speak for her, and it's very difficult to try and engineer a situation where you are with a woman who can speak her own mind without being ventriloquized by men, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
That is why female perspectives were tough. I mean, it was definitely revealing in the sense that, for example, with the cotton industry, women told me that essentially they had 2 weeks. They had 4 weeks maternity leave, so they had 2 weeks before they had the baby and 2 weeks after, and then they're expected to be on the fields. Likewise, if a woman transgressed, if a woman wasn't doing the labour required by the colonial state, it'd be the man that got whipped. So there's a very gendered nature. The colonial state is extremely patriarchal. So doing those kinds of things made me really understand the patriarchal nature of the state. Interestingly, I did, again, the weight of the present was felt in my fieldwork in the sense I spoke to a female chief. And the interesting thing with talking to a female chief, obviously, was that the colonial state really hated female chiefs. It saw female chiefs as an aberration. Remember that it took women a long time to get the vote in Western European societies. And so having female positions of authority was looked upon as an aberration, not something that was progressive. So speaking to a female chief was interesting, but in a way that was difficult because it was not representative of the colonial period at all. And I was talking with her about her present experiences and so forth. And it was a fascinating discussion, but it wasn't something that had much bearing on the past, if that makes sense, because the colonial state was so patriarchal and so anthropocentric.
So, and what is up? What next for you? What are you researching right now?
So what I'm doing now is to research U.S. Protestants in Congo. So I feel I've done a lot of research into Catholic missionaries, and so what I want to do now is to look at the other side of the coin, to look at United States missionaries. And I've done this really because I was very interested in Jason Senway. So as I said earlier in the podcast, I've written an article about Jason Senway, who was trained by Methodists, and I never really understood the history of Methodists in Congo. And I was intrigued, so I want to do a study of US Protestants generally, not just Methodists, but also Presbyterians. And you'll know, and many of your listeners will know, that US Presbyterians were on the front lines in the struggle against the Free State atrocities. And so they played a very, very important part in the Congo. And I'm being very ambitious. I don't know how successful I'll be, but I'm being very ambitious because I think that using a mission perspective is important to gain another perspective on the US-Congo relationship generally. Because I think the US-Congo relationship is often seen as Congo atrocities, then you get to the assassination of Lumumba, then you get to Mobutu, and that's kind of it, barring a hunt for uranium. And what I want to say is the US had a very, very long and very considerable relationship with the Congo through missionaries, and that at various times missionaries played a crucial part in global politics in terms of the Presbyterians, William Morrison and William Shepherd, but also in terms of daily lives. In terms of the daily lives of Congolese people on the ground, that like the Catholics, they produced a lot of schools, and they were fundamental in training a number of people like Jason Senway, who turned out to be very important nationalists. So it's a study of US Protestants in the Congo throughout the colonial period, although I may go beyond the colonial period, which is what I'm working on at the moment.
Oh, excellent. Sounds very interesting.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much.
All right, I'm going to wrap up the podcast now. Thank you for coming on, Reuben Loffman.
Thank you ever so much. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.